let's begin. Incidentally, Paulus Press has been undertaking a project, a little series called Rediscovering Vatican II, and all 16 documents with some basically commentary on these documents are in these 8 volumes now, and they just finished them. It's underway for the last 2 or 3 years. And there's some people that you would recognize. Cardinal Cassidy does the one on ecumenism, and Galliards, how do you say his name, does the one on the church. And so they're fairly recognized up-to-date authorities. And it's in a nice set. This would cost more than $100, so it's a matter of a parish library or something. But you might be interested in one or the other of them. So that, I just noticed that Paulus is advertising this set. We're talking about the Church of the Modern World, the Pastoral Constitution, and we're doing this in 2 sets. So we introduced it last month, and we're going to do the second part this month. As we noted, in this particular document, you have a good example of the church doing theology. So theology, basically, it's a kind of science. It's a way of understanding what's going on. And you begin by looking at your experience. What's the data? What's happening? And then you stop and ask some questions. What might be causing this? What might we do to relate to this? What's predictable about this? So you begin to ask these questions for understanding, and you come to some insight about what's going on. That insight may or may not be an eternal wisdom. Insights come a dime a dozen. So then you continue to test those insights and then come to some kind of a judgment that you can pretty much rely on. So that's what's going on here. So in the Gaudium et Spes, the Constitution on the Church of the Modern World, they spend the whole first part talking about the basic principles and examining the events, what's going on in the world, and then they come to applying it to specific situations. Some of the principles that they arrived at were things like the value of the human person. This is something that's pretty much the last century that we're becoming more and more aware of, the integrity of the human person. So that becomes a principle that we can rely on. The notion of historicity, which had not been, we weren't aware of. We may have had history books, but we pretty much figured that history was pretty much kind of, the engine was going along exactly the same speed all the time. Historicity is a way of realizing that there are developments that happen, and that one era may not be quite the same as a previous one. It isn't just a matter of a new emperor. It may be a new kind of empire. So that's historicity. So they became aware that this is happening in the church as well. So those kinds of things are basic principles that they came up with. In the second part, which is called in English, is translated some more urgent problems. Keep in mind the word problem in Latin does not mean something that's wrong or that's sinful or a difficulty as such. Problem is something that needs some thought. It's a challenge that you've got to stop and think about and figure out what's going on here. So similar to when we say in a mathematics class, you give an assignment of several problems for the students to work on. That's what a problem is. It's something that challenges your understanding and may bring you to some new insights. So this section deals with 5 problems, more current issues that are important. The church in the world is not a brand new idea. Ever since God said, "I will be your God and you shall be my people," you're already talking about the religious influence in the society of the people. So the Israelites saw themselves as a people, a society that God had made a covenant with and had given them a certain land. So this is an ancient idea. And in Christianity, we sometimes think that the first 300 years was just steady bloodshed of one martyr after another. And there were a lot of martyrs in those first 300 years. But really, for the most part, those persecutions flared up by individual emperors who were crazy, like Nero, or who were covetous of the church's possessions, what little they had, or their power, their influence on other people. And so there were some spats of persecutions, but probably more of the time was spent in some kind of a live and let live situation. The church didn't have a public recognition, but it was fermenting and growing and developing and forming its own relationships and own way of doing things. And it wasn't until the Edict of Milan that there was this kind of formal statement that Christianity now is the formal religion of the Roman Empire. But so that is what they did, and so the church has been engaged in the world pretty much from the beginning. There are certain groups of Christians who don't believe that. The Amish have a difficulty with being related to the world, and so they kind of are separate from the world. But the Catholic Church has never been that kind of an exclusive separatist kind of movement. The exception to that is what O'Malley calls the long 19th century, which extends from the French Revolution up until recently, the 1980s or so, 1970s or 80s, where there was this conscious effort, especially on the part of first it was the French Revolution and then the Marxist Revolution, to establish societies without any reference to religion. In our country, we decided to have a separation between church and state, but we recognized the importance of religion. Whereas these movements had come to the conclusion that religion was more harm than good, and we should do away with it. So that's a quirk. That's not the standard in human life, human history. And it's pretty much proven to be a failed experiment at this point. If you take a basic class in sociology or anthropology, you'll usually find a little diagram like I put here with 5 structures of any human society. And the family is usually placed sort of at the apex, and that's kind of the unit of human society. And then the 2 wings of that are the religion and culture. Culture includes things like your way of doing things together, but also how you pass that on to the next generation. In Western society, we have schools, but you don't have to have an institution called a school. Any way you pass on the traditions to the next generation is part of culture. In most societies, the culture and the religion kind of operate back and forth together. And the family, of course, is both nourished by the culture and the religion, as well as participates in church, religion, and culture. And then, kind of at the base, to keep it running, you've got the economy, which is the way we get what we need to survive, food, shelter, and that kind of thing. as well as politics, the way we make decisions about the common good for the whole group. So these 5 structures exist if it's an Aboriginal tribe in Australia or a modern secular society. These 5 structures are considered to be pretty much basic. And what you have is interconnections between them all. So family relates to not only religion and culture, but also economy and politics. Religion relates to family, culture, economy, and politics. Politics influences all 4 other ones. And so you end up with a star-shaped pattern where all of them are relating to one another. What the bishops are doing here, they don't actually say it in so many words, but what they're actually doing here is showing how religion, specifically the church, the Catholic Church, is related to the family, the culture, the economy, and the politics. And then the 5th chapter, they take another step. They realize that we're now a global village, and we can't pretend that we are just kind of a self-contained culture in this one place. That the entire earth, the entire human society is becoming related to one another. And so the 5th chapter is on world peace in terms of the interrelationships among various societies in the human race. So that's the way they organize it. And so that really is just kind of a nice way of realizing they're simply trying to address the basic structures of society. And so they call them more urgent issues to deal with. The Vatican Council opened on October 11th, 1962, and I think 10 days later was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was a pretty serious time. All over the world, we were all holding our breath at that time. Those of us who can remember that, I was in a Roman seminary at that time with no television, with one shortwave radio where we could hear BBC and get the news in English. We were wondering whether we were going to ever get back home again, because it was pretty tense. And so Pope John the 23rd actually had some contact behind the scenes with the major parties, and he decided that he had to write an encyclical, an important letter about this, that we really need to be looking for a way to solve our international problems. And so he wrote Pacem in Terris. He spent the winter writing that, published it on Holy Thursday of 1963, and he was at this point dying. Fortunately, he got it published, was able to speak about it from the little balcony from his bedroom, and then he died about a month later on Pentecost, the day after Pentecost. So the bishops took that pretty seriously, and so they used Pacem in Terris as sort of the North Star to give them some guidance in terms of writing this whole document, Church of the Modern World. And besides that, they had also had some things like Catholic Action and stuff like that that they were familiar with. So that kind of was their motivation. So the first issue they deal with is the family. And they spend a fair amount of time on it. Now, there had been some previous teachings on the family. One you hardly ever hear about is from Leo XIII. We do know is Rerum Novarum about the condition of working people, but we don't know much about this one. But then Pius XI, Costi Connubii, was much more widely known. He wrote that in 1930. Both of these encyclicals are quite defensive. They are worried about the family degenerating and problems coming up that were causing some real issues, and especially things like birth control and that kind of thing. So they're conscious of that, but they're fairly kind of rigid and not very. When you read them, you're not really inspired. You're kind of frightened by the time you finish reading them. Nevertheless, so they deal with this issue. So what I've done in the outline that I sent you, in the what is old, I have some quotes from the document from Gaudium et Spes, but I also have inserted there a few quotes from Casti Connubii and one or two, I think, from Leo, just to kind of give you an impression of the development that is in fact happening in the thinking about family life. How does the church think about family life? So, for example, in these earlier documents, they used to speak of the primary end of marriage, or the primary purpose of marriage, being to have children, and then secondary ends would be the relationship between the spouses and the fact that it's a sacrament. The Vatican Council does not use that terminology. They list different reasons, or different goods. They talk about them as goods instead of just ends. The goods of marriage being, of course, children, but the fidelity between the husband and the wife, the fact that this is a sign of God's love for all people, that God, in a sense, is the original father of a family, that the whole human race is, in a sense, a family. So this is a little fresher approach to that. And they purposely do not list primary and secondary goods or ends in this, and that they do that on purpose. Now, they weren't the first ones to think about that, and St. Augustine, as a matter of fact, has those three, but he lists them in primary, secondary order. And I've mentioned Bernard Lonergan here. Lonergan is probably not the most widely known theologian. Karl Rahner would be more widely known. They were contemporaries. Congar would be also a contemporary of, so those people we have heard about more frequently. Lonergan in 1943 wrote a little article in Theological Studies about the ends of marriage, and he comes up with this interesting way of putting it, that yes, it's true that having children is an essential end, most essential end. It's essential because the human race wouldn't survive without it, that is essential to us as human beings. But the more excellent ends are the relationship between the spouses and the fact that it's a sacrament of God's love. So he wrote this article as a way of kind of thinking about what Pius XI had said, and to see if we could look at that in slightly different ways. Unfortunately, and the editorial note when we published this in Theological Studies is, here's an interesting idea, what do you all think about it? Unfortunately, some office in the Vatican thought about it and said, we don't want to hear any more about this. And so there were never any more articles published about that. But the bishops here are, apparently somebody did some reading, and they're kind of coming up with the same thing. That you don't need to speak of primary and secondary. Let's look at them as acts of persons. By the way, in the very first line of paragraph 46, having outlined the dignity of the human person, so you're dealing with human person, and then in the first paragraph of, paragraph 48, the marriage is a human act. Now that may, we just let that go over our heads, it's a human act. Well, yeah, of course it's a human act. Well, that's a technical word in theological writings. A human act, that's where you really can speak of good and evil, is in human acts. A human act. If you have a hurricane named Katrina or Sandy, that swamps out a whole city. That's a terrible, we would call it an evil, but it really isn't a moral evil. It's an act of nature. By the way, it's not an act of God. We often say an act of God. Well, it's not an act of God. It's an act of nature. If we didn't have a planet that had water in it and wind and other kinds of variable storms and things, none of us would be here. This would be either a hard rock like Mars or it would be just a ball of gas like Jupiter. And so we have the kind of planet that has storms. It's a natural act. And if you happen to build your city in a place where there's wind blowing, you're going to have to prepare for that. So that's not a human act, even though it causes great distress, or it can cause great pleasure, but it's not a human act. Human acts are, if you take a bulldozer and knock over somebody's house, now that's a human act. You have done someone. What this guy has done in Texas, and he's grabbed that little kid who's down in the cellar that he's built, that's a human act, very evil human act. So human acts have to do with persons, human persons, the acting person doing something that's either good or not good. So they speak about marriage as a human act. The marriage, and it's in the singular, the marriage is an act of the bride and the groom, the husband and the wife, living together as one. And so that's a human act, an ongoing, day by day, for the rest of our life, human act of love for one another. And so that's the way they begin describing the human family. So this is a kind of a technical term they're using there, and that'll be important in a couple paragraphs. Notice how they talk about the way that everything that a husband and wife do, it's all done as sort of for the good of one another and for the children, and it's all an appreciation of the good of God's love. So that there's a lot of emphasis on the personal equality of husband and wife. You no longer have talk about the husband being the head of the wife. Now, Leo XIII said that, although he tries to modify it a bit by saying, even though she's a subject and obedient to the man, and we got a little power problem here, not as a servant, but as a companion. But nevertheless, he still uses that kind of language. The Vatican Council does not use that language. It's equal personal dignity of husband and wife in paragraph 49. Paragraph 50, Christian couples make a conscious decision to conceive and rear children in humble reverence for God and by shared counsel and endeavor, with an eye to their own good and that of their children, those already born and those foreseen, discerning the material and spiritual conditions of the times and their condition of life, bearing in mind the good of the family, of human society, and the church. In other words, married couples take every blessed decision, from making breakfast in the morning to packing lunches to setting curfews, to checking report cards, to meeting with teachers. Everything you do, which sometimes drives you crazy, but it's all done in love. It's all a part of bringing the love of God to bear in this little situation where we live in our family. And so, obviously, this is not just a matter of procreation. This is a matter of nurturing life that is a continual process of growth. The husband and the wife are both developing and growing throughout this process. The children are all growing, and there's a mutual love going on. And granted, there are struggles and there's problems, but that's how human life unfolds. And you know, every decision is in some way or other a participation in the sacrament. Incidentally, it doesn't say it in so many words here, but I'm sure you've heard that when you get married, the minister, the priest who presides, is not marrying, is not conferring the sacrament. The husband and the wife confer the sacrament on each other. So two baptized people confer the sacrament on one another. It's our sacrament. We're doing it with one another. So that's that mutual human act. That's what it is. Now, this is important for a current situation in the modern world. In paragraph 51, couples can be restricted by modern living conditions and find themselves in circumstances in which the number of their children cannot be increased, at least for a time, and the constant expression of love and the full sharing of life are maintained only with difficulty. So the bishops are recognizing a reality that had not been recognized by any previous church teaching, that there are times when intimacy of married life, and I put this in bold print, when the intimacy of married life is broken off, the good of fidelity can frequently be at risk, and the good of children can be undermined. And then the bringing up of children and the readiness to have further children are endangered. In other words, the good, the end of having children, you can't just blindly do it because one good might sacrifice the other. And so that could destroy the family. So they're being very realistic about this. And so now Casti Connubii did give this one tiny little window of opportunity. They said that if you can figure out when the fertile time is, and you have sexual intercourse in the proper way at that time, even though you know that there won't be a child conceived, it's still all right to do it. He kind of begrudgingly says that it's all right. Well, that was an opening, and the bishops here are saying, now what they're doing here is saying there may in fact be, rather often, I think they use the word often, that it happens that may be the case. That in other words, families do have the right and the responsibility as loving parents to decide their children, when the children will be born, to have some hand in planning their children. So this is a new thing. This had not been said before in church teachings. Now, they do specify some egregious ways that you don't want to do this. Obviously, they're aware that in some countries they don't want to have too many girls. They want to have boys, so they may even kill a girl infant. Those kinds of things. They specify stuff like that as being obviously that's a terrible affront against the dignity of the human person. But they don't mention anything about birth control. They mention it in the sense that there needs to be some consult with the church authorities as well as with medical doctors and whoever else is an expert in this to decide how they might do this best. But they claim that they're not going to make any specific recommendation about that. So that's paragraph 51.3. When there's a question of reconciling marital love with the responsible transmission of life, the moral character of the behavior does not depend simply on the good intentions or evaluation of motive. In other words, here they're saying you can't just do it just because it feels good, but ought to be determined by objective criteria. All right, well, any human act has to be based on objective criteria, not just by an emotional whim. Granted, there's this fundamental bias here that we get from Plato and Aristotle, that the emotions, especially sexuality, are the lower emotions, right? And the human beings ought to be using the higher powers, which is the intellect. So they're still kind of caught in that basic way of thinking, that the emotions are kind of inferior to the mind. I think a better way to say that is that, granted, emotions do sometimes have a mind of their own. And you can't just always do what emotionally you feel like doing. So that's what road rage is, right? So we do have the responsibility to manage our emotions, to have some intelligent guidance for our emotions. And if we realize that we're becoming more and more angry about one thing or the other, and we've all done this, I'm sure, this is no personal confession. There are times when you're so angry at someone or at some reality and you're just stewing about it every time you get a chance, and you're driving down the expressway and you're thinking about it and banging on the steering wheel, and well, you gotta handle that, You can't let that kind of anger continue to ferment and continue to take charge of your life. So it is true that emotions can run wild and can, in fact, take over. And we are responsible human beings, so we do have to intelligently take charge, take control of our emotions in a graceful and responsible way. But that doesn't mean we just suppress them. You don't just pack them down and pretend they don't exist. If there's anger there, if there's desire, whatever emotion it is, it has to be acknowledged and it has to be dealt with in a responsible way, and if it's in danger of causing some problem, you have to figure out some way that you can gracefully transcend that particular emotion or get that emotion to channel it in a different way. So they make recognition here that you don't want to just do things spontaneously out of emotion, but derived from the nature of the person and its acts. Notice that the acting person again, which take account of the whole meaning of mutual giving and human procreation in the context of true love. In other words, the conceiving of children is part of the love that you had between husband and wife. It's in that context of the love for each other that the child is then just a natural fruit of the love between the husband and the wife. This cannot be achieved if the virtue of marital chastity is not sincerely practiced. Notice that you use the word chastity. Chastity means dignity, respect. It doesn't necessarily mean abstinence. It means dignity and respect for the other person. It means using your sexual instinct and emotion and all of that goes into that affection in a way that's respectful, and both parties are developing, growing by that particular encounter. It's not permitted to take steps for regulating procreation which are rejected by the teaching authority in its explanation of the divine law. And that's where it stops. Then they put a footnote. And in the footnote, they say, we're not about to say here what practical decisions are right or wrong. We're laying out the principles here, and they do acknowledge that there will be a commission that's underway. They knew this commission was already in place, that there might be some further teaching on this, but right now, we're not going to make any specific teaching. Now, here's a sidebar. Me and 2 or 3 of my friends are convincing in the front office of the seminary where we were living. And in the North American College, there were 3 or 4 cardinals, bishops and cardinals who lived there also during the council, among them being John Dearden. And so one evening, about 8 o'clock at night, now in the winter time, it's dark, 8 o'clock at night, pretty much everybody's gone home by this time, and there isn't much commerce going on. It's not like Spain where you're up until 10 o'clock at night in the streets. So suddenly the guy, we would be kidding around with this guy, the portiere, who was the doorkeeper, and he was a real clown, and we really we just enjoyed going down there when there was not much going on. And he answered the phone and he ran the door. There was a big gate there's a big fence around the college, and there's a gate where someone could drive in, and he controlled that with a button. And so he suddenly gets very serious. He gets his phone call, and he suddenly, And so he opens the gate, and here comes a car with the Vatican license plates on it, and even the flag on the fender. And then the elevator opens, out comes Dearden and another bishop, and they come tromping by. No salutation, hello boys or anything. Out they go, hop in the car and disappear. And so what in the world is that about? Well, we found out what that was about. This is about December 1st of 1965. This document has not been, it has been passed. Every blessed paragraph has been considered and talked about and rewritten and gone back to committee for 2 years now. And it's just about ready for the final vote. And the final vote will be on December 7th, the day before the council, the last working day of the council. The next day, December 8th, will be the final celebration. So this vote is going to take place on December 7th. Well, Dearden and whoever was with him, I forget who it was, had found out that one of the drafters, one of the people in the Vatican, had actually put this footnote in the main text and had specified that you couldn't use any artificial birth control. And that was being inserted into the text. The bishops, when they were going to vote, would probably not even have seen it. I mean, you can't sit there and read this entire 100 paragraphs, right there in the hall. They're going to assume that the paragraphs that they voted on already are going to be presented the way they voted on them, so that they can make the final vote. So they were now, these two bishops were on their way to see Pope Paul VI himself, because somebody else had already got to Paul VI to convince him that they should put this footnote in there. And they went to make sure that it got taken out again, that there was not to be any, they said explicitly, we said we don't want to make any specific statements about this. That is up to the future to study. And notice that they have several references, like in paragraph 52, biological, medical, social, psychological sciences can be of considerable service to the good of marriage and the family, to the peace of conscience, if they collaborate in trying to throw more light on the various conditions which favor the virtuous control of procreation. So these authors were presuming that there may be some graceful ways of using proper procedures with medical science and psychological science, figuring out ways that you could gracefully space your children. And they did not want to have any specific prohibition in there. So, in any case, the text was reverted back to the form that we have it, which what they had designed, the authors had wanted it to be. But a couple of years later, Paul VI does have this committee on birth control, and they come up with the conclusion, how can we change our mind now? We've got these very strong prohibitions by Leo XIII and by Pius XI against any artificial birth control. We would look foolish if we were to change our mind at this point. Of course, what has happened is that now they look foolish because they didn't consider a broader outlook on this, but nevertheless. When that encyclical came out, Dearden couldn't say it publicly, but did say it privately, as he was talking with us as now we're all hearing confessions. He said, we really expected that we would find, he said, granted, we don't want people doing disgraceful things and things that would be harmful to one another or demeaning one another, but we figured that there would be some allowance for this. But that's not what's happened. So we live with that. We'll figure out how to get along. But the system that we now promote is natural family planning, which works for some people. Doesn't work for everybody. But the principle is that the whole point is the human act is the person's love for one another. So that's the important thing. It isn't just the physical action of sexual intercourse. That is subsumed in the larger, the greater act of the love for one another. So that was the principle that they're using here. And that would still hold. All right. Culture. The bishops used to talk about culture, and they are making a fairly new statement here that there is a plurality of cultures. This is new. What we thought was, from the time of the Greeks, is that there is one human culture. Some people are uncultured, so they need to be educated so that they can become cultured, like we are. But there's only one culture. That would be the classical way of looking at things, so that the whole human race ultimately should be like we Greeks are. That was the assumption for several centuries. But what they're saying here is that there's a plurality of cultures, that various places and times had different cultures, different conditions, peculiar to each human community. Now that's a very important insight, because that's going to mean that the church, if it's present at all in any of these cultures, is going to have to relate to that culture in whatever uniqueness that culture has. Now, a great example of trying to do it and then being forbidden to do it would be Matteo Ricci, who was a Jesuit in China. And what he did was, he realized that as a knowledgeable person, not only about God and faith, but also about science and irrigation and a variety of other. The Jesuits in the 1700s were widely educated people, and so they were good at all kinds of projects, and so Ricci kind of came as sort of a wise teacher to China. Wore the garb, instead of his Jesuit European garb, he wore the garb of a teacher in China. And he gave advice about how to plant crops as well as how to pray. And he began to offer the liturgy in Chinese so that the people could actually see that the Christian faith really was a wonderful way to frame the life that we're living. Well, he got clomped on by the authorities because he was not saying the Mass in Latin. And he had to stop doing it. And unfortunately, that kind of restricted the influence, that we lost a huge opportunity of presenting the Christian faith to a huge continent of people because we refused to acknowledge the cultural adaptation, the way that these people fought and lived together. We missed a big opportunity there. People like Ricci knew what to do, but they weren't allowed to carry on with it. Finally, here we're saying that we need to be more conscious of the cultures of the people that we're working with. Notice they make a statement in paragraph 54. We're in a new age in human history, so that this explosion of differences and variety is a new age in human history. The exact sciences encourage critical judgment, psychology, explaining human behavior, historical disciplines contributing to examine different points of view, evolution, customs, at the same time, customs becoming more uniform, and industrialization, urbanization, other factors are leading to new forms of mass culture. So there's both things happening here simultaneously. On the one hand, we're aware of a variety of cultures. At the same time, we're also aware of worldwide communication. Now this is 1964 and 65. There is not yet any satellite communications, but there were ways occasionally of rigging up a TV transmission that you could actually see a live TV transmission from one city in a different city without the antenna, through either phone wires or some way. And they were becoming aware, oh man, we're able to actually see what's going on all over the world. So we're becoming a kind of a world community. So this is a new age in human history. New awareness of autonomy and responsibility. Now that goes along with this integrity of the human person. A new humanism is being born in 55. A new humanism is being born in which the human is defined above all in terms of our responsibility to our sisters and brothers and to history. Now Hans Kuhn was a young theologian at this time, and he has spent the rest of his career, he's an old man now and retired, but he's still active, and his project is to come up with a worldwide pan-cultural ethic. There must be some ethical principles that we can all agree to. Because ethics has to do with the nature of the human person. And so there are some things that are going to be culturally bounded, but there should be some things, like murder, for example, that are not going to be allowed anywhere. And so his project has been to continue hammering out and distilling what could we come to a consensus about across cultures that we all agree on in terms of a universal ethical standards. So that's been a project of his, and here's where the inspiration came from. They are aware, the bishops are aware that this communication and industrialization and urbanization is causing some disruption among a lot of native cultures, and there is some concern about that. How do we preserve the integrity of the different native cultures and at the same time progress in science? So they were aware of that issue. Notice again at the top of page 4 in my notes, it would be in paragraph 56. Human culture must evolve into a balanced cultivation of the entire human person, helping people discharge the duties to which all, especially the faithful, are called, united as sisters and brothers in the one human family. So there are some unhappy consequences, but they're not the inevitable result of modern culture. So they're recognizing new issues, new things to think about, but it's not, we should not be pessimistic. Some people claim that this document is too optimistic, that it does not face the difficult facts of life. They really are aware of the difficult facts of life, but they want to be hopeful. This is meant to be a visionary statement, a prophetic statement calling for some collaboration that does not yet exist. I mean, they were aware, they knew what the Cold War was going on. This was in the midst of the Cold War. They knew what the crisis, the nuclear arms and stuff like that. They knew all those things, but they're calling for a better way of life. We as human beings can live better than this. So that's basically the purpose of this. And so these next paragraphs, 58, 59, 60, the church has been sent to all peoples. 60.2 and 3, all people need opportunities for education so they can participate in developing their culture. 61.1, it's becoming more difficult to arrive at a synthesis. The image of the universal individual is disappearing, yet each individual has a duty to have regard for the whole human person. So they realize this is kind of paradoxical, but they feel we have to grapple with this. Recent science, history, philosophy, psychology, sociology give rise to new inquiries and demand new investigations by theologians. There's a difference between the deposit of faith and the manner in which it is expressed. That's an issue that we continue to grapple with. Sometimes we think that the way a certain teaching has been expressed has been canonized for all time, but that may not be the case. The way it's expressed had to be put into language and a philosophy and a way of thinking and experience of a given group of people. The truth is underlying that, and we don't have the full truth at any point in time, so the expression may have to be modified or developed in order to keep getting at this truth and help this new environment understand that truth. The difference between the deposit of faith and the manner in which it is expressed. Well, let's move along. Socioeconomic life. This is something that's been percolating since Leo XIII and 1891, Rerum Novarum, and then 40 years later, Pope Leo Pius XI writes Quadragesimo Anno, which means 40 on the 40th year, the 40th anniversary. That's the beginning of that encyclical, so it's titled Quadragesimo Anno. Pius XII gives a radio address on the 50th anniversary. John the 23rd publishes Mater et Magistra in 1961. That's on the 70th anniversary. Now, incidentally, John the 23rd's Mater et Magistra is a fairly technical document and is simply a way of kind of updating what has been unfolding by these previous encyclicals. It doesn't make for very good bedside reading. And he, when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, he realized he had to do a different approach. So Pacem in Terris is much different. Pacem in Terris addressed to all people, by the way, not just to bishops or Catholics, addressed to all people, and much more down to earth, and much more inclusive, mentioning the conditions of women and all kinds of things that they had never talked about before. So that's the 70th anniversary. And Paul VI writes two encyclicals, and I rather know only one, Populorum Progressio, the Development of Peoples, in 1967. That wasn't exactly an anniversary year, but then I failed to put in here, but then he did come out with, he called a Synod of Bishops in 1971, which would be the 80th anniversary, right? And in 71, he calls the Synod of Bishops to deal with two things. One, the priesthood, and two, social justice. Now that's a lot to handle in one synod. A synod is just an occasional meeting of bishops, and only a few representative bishops show up for that, but from all over the world. And there's a basic agenda, and we're going to talk about this, and what's your opinions, and then they sum it up. Well, so he writes this letter, the apostolic letter, Octogesimo Adveniens, that's the 80th year is approaching, calling to mind Leo XIII, and he convenes this synod, and this synod is the document, by the way, those of us who were priests by this time, 1971, I was ordained for like 6 years by this time, 5 or 6 years, we were thinking that maybe they're going to let priests get married. That was a wide rumor that was going around. That didn't happen, but what they did say was that they started off by saying that justice is constitutive to the gospel. The work of justice is constitutive to the gospel. It's in the constitution of the Christian gospel, the work of justice. So this was a way of kind of pushing further the church's teaching on economic justice and on equality of people in society, especially in terms of the economy. And so that's kind of a famous quote that you made here. And Paul VI had made it a slogan: if you want peace, work for justice. fact, we even bumper stickers like that. If you want peace, work for justice. The work of justice is constitutive of the gospel. John Paul II writes an encyclical Laborem Exercens on the 90th anniversary, and then again Centesimus Annus on the 100th anniversary of Leo XIII. So the church has a track record for addressing, now at least, addressing economic issues. We started kind of late. Leo XIII was writing after Charles Dickens. Dickens was more influential in terms of the economic problems, but we have tried to address those issues in recent times. And in the United States, we took that seriously. Even before the Vatican Council, you had so-called labor schools, lots of labor priests getting their working men together in church basements, reading the encyclicals of Leo XIII and Pius XI, and organizing labor unions and that kind of thing. So, the chapter 4 of the political community, notice the word common good keeps popping up. Virtually every paragraph mentions the word common good. This is an old-time Catholic principle, comes from Thomas Aquinas, maybe even Augustine, that the common good is, in fact, comes from Aristotle, so that you have personal good, and then you have the good of the relationship of your family and your friends, your immediate community, and then you have the larger society, and that's the common good. And sometimes the personal convenience or personal preference has to give way to the family, and you all know that. You teach the children that every day. You have to learn it yourself. And then sometimes the family unit has to accommodate itself to the common good. So this is a three-tier, so that the cardinal virtues are based on that. So that each cardinal virtue is the integrity of the self, fidelity with your immediate family, and justice in the larger community. So the word justice is basically about the common good. And then finally, the fifth section is on world peace. Notice that in paragraph 79, they already were aware that acts of terrorism was going to become a new kind of warfare. This is 1965. There weren't too many examples of that at this point, but apparently it was already beginning. And it's become the norm now. But acts of terrorism are a new means of warfare. The ethnic cleansing is not moral. You cannot do that. Wipe out a whole ethnic group in your country. They allowed for conscientious objectors. This is the first place the Catholic Church, even though we generally support the government in which the church exists, but here they state that citizens can be exempted from military service if they object to it in conscience. And so the Vietnam War is just heating up at this point. In fact, very hot. This is 1965. The Vietnam War kind of got underway in about 63, and by 65, it's really going. And so the American bishops then made a statement not long after this, allowing Catholics to declare that they, up until this time, only if your religion as a group said you were totally pacifist. So Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witness, they were excluded. I think Amish do not have, they could just be excluded because they're a member of that religion. Catholics can't do that, but you as an individual Catholic can, if you're willing to go to the board, not parole board, what board is it? Draft board, yeah. And prove that you are conscientiously against carrying arms. You have a right to do that. Total war is not moral. The arms race is really not a safe path toward peace. The arms race was a big thing going on then. Nuclear arms. People like Dorothy Day were in Rome as this was being drafted, and meeting with the bishops. There were various committees that were actually meeting with people about this, and so that's why I first met her. She was a very impressive woman, and we're in this dumpy old theater. The seats were all falling apart and not very many lights. It was just a ratty old place. And so we went to hear Dorothy Day. And so she gets on the stage and she looks around and she says, "Oh, why is it? I always end up in palaces like this." So she was part of an American delegation of peace people who talk with the bishops about this. Notice in 82, ideally, a universal public authority would work toward all nations agreeing to a complete ban on war. So there's, obviously that's a very idealistic statement, but the church needs to say something like that. I mean, we do believe that people should all figure out ways. We teach conflict resolution to our kids in families and in schools. We should be able to teach one another conflict resolution in a peaceful way, respectful way. So we're not deceiving ourselves by false hopes, but the church is responsible to promote the common good of the whole world by reconciling feelings of hostility, contempt, mistrust, racial hatred, and ideological obstinacy. So that's a very true statement. Granted, it's almost Pollyanna, but the church has to be a prophet calling for the common good. So notice that, and then they have a general conclusion, and I'll be finished, and then we can ask questions and talk about this. The council proposes here it's received doctrine of the church, even though it's deliberately general in tone. And it realizes that there's an evolution that will need further discussion. So this is not something that just kind of fell out of the sky or bubbled up from the ground, depending on your point of view. This is received doctrine of the church, but fashioned in a unique new way for the new situation, and calls for dialogue, calls for mutual esteem, respect, and harmony, recognizing legitimate diversity in the church itself. This is a very important statement, and many Catholics do not know this statement exists. For what unites the faithful is stronger than what divides them. There should be unity in essentials, freedom in doubtful matters, and charity in everything. Of course, the question is, what is a doubtful matter? Some people think everything is certain, that there's nothing that's doubtful. And of course, they're the ones who know what is certain. So that's where the problem is figuring out what is doubtful. Unity in essential matters, freedom in doubtful matters, and charity in everything. Sometimes some of the things you see on the internet and whatnot do not look like there's much charity. Our love for the truth excludes nobody. Neither, this is 92.5, neither those who cultivate the values of the human spirit while not yet acknowledging their source, that would mean God, nor those who are hostile to the church and persecuted in various ways. In other words, it doesn't exclude even these folks. Since God our Father is the origin and destiny of all things, we are called to be sisters and brothers. Therefore, in our common human and divine vocation, we can and should work together without violence and deceit and in true peace to build the world. Now, one would think that in this last year, with the American bishops and with the Affordable Care Act, Health Care Act, that the bishops might have found a more graceful way to collaborate, even with politicians who might possibly entertaining birth control. That looks like we did not listen to this particular statement. There should have been a more graceful way of stating, yes, we do believe in health care for everybody. That's not, that's a cause that we really do care about. And there are ways of working out the practical details. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. Basically, what this document is doing, you remember that in Lumen Gentium, there's a little paragraph, there's a section on the Pilgrim Church. But the Pilgrim Church, almost every paragraph of that section focuses on the destiny, on the final goal of the pilgrimage, which is heaven and living with God. It doesn't talk much about what goes on during the pilgrimage. This document is about the pilgrimage. So the church, that's why they call it the pastoral constitution. It has to do with the practical application of our belief in the realm of God, the fact that God has created the whole world and the whole human race. And we are all on this pilgrimage to some final destination of life with God. But here in this world, we have lots of things to deal with. And it's not always patently clear. There are times when things are confused and some terrible things are happening. What are we going to do about it? So this is what it's about. It's about creating kind of a map, a road map, and a guide light to figure out how do we undergo this pilgrimage. It doesn't say that this world is the end-all and be-all. The end-all and be-all is eternity with God. But we're living here for now, and so it's important to make our life among one another as gracious as possible. And to do reconciling where that's important, to create new opportunities where that's needed and possible, to do all these things that make it more likely that we will all make our way on this pilgrimage toward God. So that's basically what this whole Gaudium et Spes is all about. Yes?
We are open to the promptings of the Spirit arising from conversation with all who recognize God.
Yeah, okay, so 92.4 and then 92.5. So, first of all, we're recognizing how the Spirit is working for all those who recognize God. And then, the next paragraph is, and then even those who don't know about God. So you start with people who you have a common faith in God. You ought to be able to find some colleagues there because we all recognize God's presence. In fact, there's a little, in parenthesis, 92 starts universal dialogue. In its mission to spread the light of the gospel over the entire globe and bring all people of whatever nation, race, or culture together into one spirit. The church comes to be a sign of that kinship which makes genuine dialogue possible and vigorous. So then the next paragraph is working with those who believe in God. The next paragraph, even brothers and sisters who do not know God, but who still have some basic genuine desire to enhance the human person. That doesn't have to be Christian. It can be anybody. Even those who might persecute the church in some ways. So even those who appear to be on a different page, they probably, if you look at it, if you study it, you probably can find some common ground. That's what they're saying.
What struck me was the belief here that the Spirit is in all these creations of God, in God's image. Mm-hmm. And we are open to the promptings of the Spirit.
That's one of the basic principles that is a new insight at this time, that the work of grace is everywhere. Grace is not confined just to the church. God's grace is everywhere. And it comes in, God loves people in different ways and different, they do the best they can. And so, yes, and so this is recognizing that and then entering into dialogue with all of these folks. Because you can trust that somehow the Spirit of God is present there if you respect one another as human beings. Incidentally, this is a response to the whole postmodern thing that currently we call it, in intellectual circles, they talk about postmodernism, and that we don't have anything in common. Well, yeah, we do have some things in common, and one of those would be the integrity of the human person. Virtually everybody agrees to that. Everybody agrees that art and science and things are important. So there are ways that we can communicate.
In 92.2, again, the statement there about there should be unity in essentials. It seems like there are so many different views of what are essentials. For example, is it, and they change. And married priests, women priests, how we treat sexual minority people, gay marriage, all these things some people think are essentials. And for others, there's no freedom in doubtful matters. Some of us think those are doubtful matters. So the essential and doubtful matters are very different for different people.
Yep, that's where the rub is.
This kind of relates to what the last gentleman just said. At the end of chapter 1, I think you say this, that they're not discussing mixed marriages. So are you talking interfaith, interracial, intersexual, or is it, and what was the history of this time? Did people come out after this and say, wait a second, you didn't talk about...
That's in reference to Consti Connubii, that they were against any kind of interreligious marriages, and so that they considered that to be the way Pope Pius XI puts it, that even if once in a blue moon we might possibly see some reason why we would have to allow it to happen, it's still not going to be a good marriage. But the Vatican Council doesn't even address the issue of marriages of any kind, mixed marriage, so interreligious or anything else. They just don't even address it. Yeah. But it was brought up by Pius XI as definitely a problem to be avoided at all costs. And if you remember, I can remember having a couple of classmates whose parents, one of the parents was not Catholic, and they're only half Catholic. Poor kids, how can they be really true Catholics? Their father's Protestant.
Well, because at that time in history, that's when interracial, interfaith, those things were happening, we're seeing more and more, and that's one of the things that counts.
But they're speaking, I was speaking here about interreligious because that was spinning off from the Costi community.
That wasn't just the case between religions, because parishes were set up ethnically, and there were wars, and people of different colors out. So it was kind of in continuity with all of that.
It's an old-fashioned, classical notion of how families need to be constructed. They have to have the solidarity of both. The two families are going to marry each other, and they have to have common ground. So that was the instinct there. And so even, yeah, you're right, even Irish and German was a mixed marriage. But if they were both Catholic, they'd get away with it. Thank you.
I've got a different topic. When you were speaking in the section on peace, what came into my mind, and all of a sudden it kind of put things in a different perspective, and that has to do with the weapons when we talk about the dignity of life. And those semi-automatic weapons or military weapons are weapons of mass destruction. And if we started to think about what the destruction is and whose hands they're in, maybe we'd look at changing these laws in a different way. It just hit me this morning.
Incidentally, there's a bishop, there apparently now are two Bishop Tobins. The Tobin from Detroit is now the Bishop of Indianapolis, but there's also a Bishop Tobin in New Jersey. And he just came out with a pastoral letter, not very long, but very specific, that possessing weapons is not a fundamental human right. You can't talk about it that way. So it just is kind of contributing to the conversation. You can't say that you have an absolute right to possess weapons.
This is such a profound document. Even as a political document. And my question is, when we speak of the plurality of cultures, how far does this document take us in ecumenism? You know, we've seen it shut this thing off. As long as you're Christian, you're all right. But, you know, there's been Huntington's book and whatnot on the conflict of civilizations and whatnot. And Hans Kung in his global ethic, it talks about everybody. And so I guess the question is, how far do we go and how far does this document take us in expanding the church? I'm a big fan of the United Nations. I'm going to leave a few of these here and I'll bring some next time. And it talks a lot about that. And they've outlined some of these documents. And we know so little about them. And I guess, how far does ecumenism take us? That's the question.
Yeah, well, and we will talk about ecumenism in a later session. And they have two more documents after these. There are some smaller documents that are more focused. One is on ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, and then there's also a whole document on relating to other people of non-Christian religions, so that there are actually two phases of dialogue. But the principle is laid out here, that the Holy Spirit is everywhere, and you can trust that if there is goodwill and respect for one another, you can find some common ground, and you can work together and come to some working arrangements for the common good, that can be done. Now, there was a real flurry of ecumenical progress for a few years after the Vatican Council. That has tapered off in recent years, and that's sad that has happened. But we'll talk about ecumenism specifically at a later date.
Just last quick thought. What is this breach between Kung and the present Pope? Is that relevant to what we're talking about now?
Well, they were friends. They were pretty much contemporaries, and both German, both theologians, both young experts at the council. They both were experts for two different bishops, I think. They did have, soon after Benedict became Pope, he did invite Kung for dinner. And they had some conversation together, which apparently was congenial. But it does have two different slants on life. Originally, well, there were some differences even in the earlier days. It didn't take too long for... Ratzinger was on the first board of editors of the journal called Concilium, which the first issue came out in January of 1965. The council was still in session and hadn't had its final time yet. So Concilium is published starting in 1965. And Ratzinger was on that editorial board, along with Kung and Congar and others. Ratzinger writes an article in that first edition on the collegiality of the bishops. And it's a good article on because the church is a communion. Therefore, there has to be collegiality among the church leaders. So he's making a progressive statement in that article. But within about 5 or 6 years, Ratzinger leaves that, and he joins another group called Communio, interestingly enough, and I don't know if that continues to exist, but he then became an editor of that because he felt personally, and the people with him in this new journal, that that the concilium was taking things too far afield. So already 5 years after the council, he was becoming anxious. But Kuhn would be pretty much central. This would be Kuhn's guiding light.
Throughout the document, the word dialogue is really prominent in almost every chapter on this type of thing. What happened to dialogue?
Yeah, dialogue is a major thing here, and kind of the whole point of this whole document is to create more dialogue, because the human community needs it, the common good needs it. So yeah, it's difficult to do dialogue, and yet everybody knows if you know, in families, in schools, you have to be engaged in dialogue. You have to listen to one another. You have to come to some consensus. So yeah, it's too bad that it's hard, but it is hard to do, but it's necessary. Those of you who were around here in this church in the early 1980s, and you remember how the church, like a lot of churches, was all the 1,000 people could sit in this church, all facing forward, and then there was the communion rail, and then there was the altar, right? And so we were deciding that this church should look a little bit more like contemporary liturgy. So what we did was we spent a whole year just studying liturgy and worship without even thinking about our particular church. Anybody could be on the committee that's going to talk about renovating the church, but you had to come to these sessions first. So you had to become knowledgeable first. Once you had done that, you could be on. So the committee was huge. It was like 40 or 45 people, which is a kind of an ungainly thing. But we promised if you come to the classes, you can be on the committee, and that's what happened. So then we met for over a year, every couple of weeks, and we talked about what about the baptistry? What about all these different things? And frequently we'd come to a disagreement. And we said, okay, we have to pray about that. And we would sometimes say, well, you know what, we should really study more about whatever, And then the next meeting, we'd say, okay, what do we think? And we talk to any other people. What do we? And then sometimes it would take us several meetings before we come to a conclusion about something where there had been a difference of opinion. But we kept doing that until everybody was sure that they were heard and everybody was really listening to everybody else. And then you come up with ideas that nobody had in the beginning. And then you even change your mind. We had a different place for the baptistry at first, and then what about this? All right, so then you go back and revisit some previous decisions because a new thing is happening over here. So, all right, now we got to fit this together. So that's called dialogue, and that's the word they often use is consensus. You form a consensus. You don't take a vote and just go with the 51% majority. You come to a consensus. So that's what they're proposing here, that we do this on a world scale, in your families, in your communities, and in the whole human community. What's happened to it? Well, these are prophetic statements, and we don't always listen to the prophets.
Was it in Vatican II that they started stressing primacy of conscience? And if so, how come it's not used? No, I mean...
Actually, the issue of the human person is the fundamental principle. So that means primacy of conscience. Actually, even Aquinas talks about the primacy of conscience. So that's not a new teaching. It's given new authority by this recognition of the importance of the human person. So,
I think the term is good,
Yeah. So, but, yeah, you're right. We tend to, of course, then what they say is, it has to be a well-formed conscience. Well, that's an interesting footnote there, because that means your conscience has to be like my conscience. And that defeats the purpose. You have to listen to anybody who has something to say about it, but it doesn't mean that you have to follow any one given way of doing it. Yeah. We can have seconds.
Just recently, I saw a video about kind of like the new universe story and hooking ourselves into the reality that we literally are made of the same stuff. And the divisions that we create are kind of anti-nature. And in the same video, it talked about the role of chaos in forming order. So the message is chaos is your friend, sort of. But I think there are certain people, and I think Ratzinger was one of them, are allergic to chaos and cannot see disorder without becoming very frightened. And I do think that our leaders are in that place, and there's a sense in which we have to have compassion along with fury so that we don't wind up pulling the church apart.